In a court of whispers and lies, Lady Anya was a pawn in a queen's cruel game. Falsely accused of treason, she was stripped of her name, and condemned to a life of ruin. But the jealous queen made one fatal mistake. She never checked for the royal birthmark. The one that proved the servant she just banished was the kingdom's true heir. The great hall of Blackwood Castle was a chamber of breathtaking lies. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painted jeweled patterns on the stone floor, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny forgotten souls. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, roasted meats, and the cloying sweetness of wine, a perfume that failed to mask the stench of ambition and fear. At the high table King Theron sat, a man whose spine had long since dissolved into his velvet throne. Beside him, Queen Seraphina shone like a flawless diamond, her beauty a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. Her smile was the most beautiful lie of all. And near the dais, a silent shadow in a simple gray dress, stood Lady Anya of House Vale. She was a ghost at this feast of power, a lady in waiting whose fallen house left her with nothing but a noble name and a resilience forged in silence. She watched, she listened, she remembered everything. Her face was a mask of placid obedience, a carefully constructed defense against the world that had taken everything from her. Inside, her mind was a fortress, her thoughts the only thing that truly belonged to her. The queen's voice, clear as a silver bell, cut through the low hum of the court. "Anya, my dear, come here." Anya moved with a fluid grace that belied the tension coiled in her stomach. Every head turned. To be singled out by the queen was a thing of terror and opportunity, and no one was ever sure which it would be. She stopped before the throne and curtsied, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the intricate weave of the royal carpet. "Your Majesty," Anya's voice was a soft murmur, respectful and empty of emotion. "Rise, child, rise," Seraphina said, extending a hand laden with rings. Her tone was warm, a silken cloak for the court to admire. "I was just telling Lord Rees how diligent you have been. Such a comfort to have someone so attentive." The word hung in the air, a compliment that felt like an accusation. Anya knew what it meant. She kept her expression serene, a placid lake hiding its depths. "You are too kind, Your Majesty. I only wish to serve." "Oh." "And you do," the queen purred. She picked up her goblet, its dark metal swirling with crimson wine. "You serve so well. One almost forgets you are the daughter of a historian, a reader of dusty old books. One almost forgets the fall of House Vale." It was a deliberate cut, a reminder of Anya's powerlessness, delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head. Anya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The memory of her father, his library ransacked, his name disgraced, was a fresh wound. And now? The queen continued, a bright, cruel light in her eyes. "You have been clumsy." Before Anya could process the words, the queen's wrist turned. It was not a grand gesture, but a small, calculated movement. The heavy goblet tilted, and the dark red wine arced through the air. It struck the front of Anya's gray dress, blooming instantly into a deep, ugly stain over her heart. A collective gasp swept through the hall, a sound instantly stifled. The world seemed to stop. The wine dripped from the molle hem of her dress onto the stone floor, each drop a ticking clock. Queen Seraphina's face was a perfect portrait of theatrical shock. "Oh, my dear girl, look what you've made me do. How utterly careless of you to stand so close." Anya did not look down at the stain. She did not flinch. She slowly lifted her eyes and met the queen's gaze. In that moment, she saw past the beautiful mask to the gnawing insecurity beneath. She saw the truth. This was no accident. It was a message, a branding. "My apologies, Your Majesty," Anya said, her voice impossibly steady. "I shall have it cleaned at once." She curtsied again, a slow, deliberate movement of submission that felt like an act of war. She turned and walked away, not hurrying, even as she felt the burn of 100 pairs of eyes on her back. The stain on her dress felt as heavy as a shroud. She did not make it far. As she entered the shadows of an empty antechamber, a hand gripped her arm. It was the queen. The warmth was gone from her face, replaced by a cold reptilian fury. Her voice was a venomous whisper. "Do you think I am a fool?" Serafina hissed, her fingers digging into Anya's arm. "Standing there with your quiet judgments, with your mother's eyes, thinking I do not see you?" "I think nothing, your majesty," Anya said, her gaze fixed on a tapestry depicting a royal hunt, a deer surrounded by wolves. "You think you are better than me," the queen spat, her vanity wounded, "with your noble blood and your sad little story. Let me make this clear, little mouse. You are here because I allow it. You eat because I feed you. You are nothing more than a servant with a forgotten name." She leaned closer, her perfume suffocating. "Your father thought he was clever too. With his books and his secrets, look where it got him. A legacy of dust." The mention of her father was a knife twisted. Anya's composure finally fractured, a flicker of pain crossing her face. The queen saw it and smiled, a thin, triumphant curl of her lips. She had found the weak point. "Remember your place, Anya of Housevale. Remember who holds the power here," Serafina said, releasing her arm with a shove. "A single misstep can have permanent consequences. I have many beautiful things in this castle. Things I value, things I protect. One would not want to be accused of misplacing them." The queen smoothed her own perfect gown, her composure restored. She turned and swept back into the great hall, leaving Anya alone in the sudden silence. The threat lingered in the air, cold and sharp. Anya stood motionless for a long moment, the chill of the queen's words seeping into her bones. She looked down at the dark red stain on her dress. It was not a mark of shame. It was a declaration. A line had not been crossed. It had been drawn in blood-red wine, and in the silent fortress of her mind, behind a wall of feigned obedience, Anya knew this was only the beginning. The game was not just the queen's to play. For 3 days, a cold dread was Anya's constant companion. It was a shadow that clung to her in the sunlit gardens and followed her through the castle's torchlit halls. She performed her duties with a brittle, meticulous precision, her hands never shaking, her voice never faltering. She was a flawless machine of servitude, a strategy she hoped would make her invisible. But she could feel the queen's eyes on her even when Serafina was not in the room. The court, sensing the shift in royal favor, treated her like a leper. Whispers died when she approached. Glances were quickly averted. She was isolated on a small, shrinking island, and the tide was rising. At night, in the solitude of her small chamber, she would trace the faded ink on her father's letters, his words a reminder of a life before this gilded cage. She replayed the queen's final threat, a venomous promise that now coiled around every waking moment. It was not a question of if the axe would fall, but when. She did not have to wait long. The summons came on the 4th day. Anya was called to the queen's private solar, a room bathed in morning light where Serafina conducted her personal affairs. The other ladies in waiting were already there, their faces pale with anxiety. The queen was pacing before the hearth, her expression a mask of controlled distress. Her eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been weeping. "It is gone," Serafina announced, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "The king's signet ring. It has vanished from my writing desk." A collective gasp went through the room. The king's signet was no mere piece of jewelry. It was the instrument used to seal royal decrees, a symbol of the king's own authority. To lose it was unthinkable. To steal it was treason. "I was holding it for the king while his chambers were being cleaned," the queen explained, pressing a hand to her chest. "It was here, in this box. Only my most trusted ladies have been in this room today." Her gaze, heavy with suspicion, swept across the faces of the young women. It lingered on each one for a moment, a silent, terrifying accusation. When her eyes met Anya's, they held a flicker of something cold and sharp. It was the glint of a hunter's knife in the sun. Anya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She knew. This was the moment. The trap was springing. "I cannot have a traitor in my midst," the queen declared, her voice hardening. "Captain Valerius." The heavy oak door opened at once as if the captain had been waiting just outside. He strode into the room, his polished armor reflecting the frightened faces of the women. His own face was a grim, unreadable slate. He bowed his head to the queen. "Your Majesty, you called for me." "Captain," Seraphina said, her voice breaking dramatically, "the king's signet has been stolen. I fear one of my own ladies has betrayed the crown. You will search their chambers, all of them. Leave no corner unturned." It was a profound violation, a public stripping of their dignity. Valerius nodded once, his expression unchanging. "As you command, Your Majesty." The procession was a silent march of shame. Valerius and 2 of his guards led the ladies from room to room. He made a show of being thorough with the first 2, a cursory search that yielded nothing. But everyone knew it was theater. The air grew thick and heavy as they approached Anya's chamber at the end of the hall. Her room was sparse, containing little more than a bed, a washstand, and a small wooden chest. Valerius entered without a word and began his work. It was not a search, it was a desecration. He overturned her thin mattress. He threw her few folded clothes onto the floor. Anya stood by the door, her hands clasped before her face pale, but her back straight. She would not give the queen the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Finally, Valerius turned to the small chest at the foot of her bed. It was the only thing of value she owned, for it held her mother's locket and her father's letters. He lifted the lid. For a moment, he simply stared down into it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached inside and his fingers closed around something. When he pulled his hand out, a gasp escaped one of the guards. There, resting in the center of his armored gauntlet, was the heavy gold of the king's signet ring. It gleamed in the light from the corridor, an impossible, damning piece of evidence. Time seemed to stop. The air left. Anya's lungs. She saw the ghost of a triumphant smirk on Valerius's lips before it vanished. She saw the horrified, fascinated expressions of the other ladies. She had been perfectly, flawlessly, and hopelessly framed. There were no words, no defense, no truth that could fight the sight of that ring in her room. She was utterly and completely alone, a single flame against a rising tide of darkness. In that moment she was no longer Lady Anya. She was a traitor, a thief, a convenient story for a jealous queen. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own heart, pounding a desperate, silent drum against her ribs. But somewhere, in the deepest part of her, a different drum began to beat. It was not a rhythm of fear, but of a cold, gathering rage. Her spark of defiance had been buried under years of obedience, but it had not been extinguished. It now glowed in the darkness of her despair, a tiny, resilient ember waiting for a breath of wind to ignite. If you believe that spark must become a fire, that one person's courage can challenge an empire of lies, let your voice be heard. Show your support by clicking the like button. Captain Valerius turned to face her, the ring held out as proof of her guilt. "Lady Anya of House Vale," he said, his voice ringing with false authority, "you are under arrest for high treason against the crown." The guards stepped forward, their hands grabbing her arms. They were rough, their purpose clear. She did not struggle. As they pulled her from the room, she looked past them, down the long corridor toward the queen's solar, and for a fleeting second, she could have sworn she saw Seraphina's silhouette in the doorway watching, her face lit with a victorious smile. Then she was gone, and Anya was being dragged toward the dungeons, her fate to be decided by a justice that had already been bought and paid for. The trial was a farce, a piece of theater performed in the cavernous throne room for an audience of none. King Theron slumped on his throne, looking anywhere but at Anya, his face a mask of weary indifference. The true judge sat beside him. Queen Seraphina, draped in black as if in mourning, presided over the proceedings with a somber grace that was utterly obscene. Captain Valerius presented the case with grim efficiency. The evidence was the ring itself, displayed on a velvet cushion, its golden gleam a silent, irrefutable lie. There were no witnesses to call, no questions to be asked. When Anya was given the chance to speak, she remained silent. Words were useless here. The truth was a foreign currency in a court that traded only in power. Her silence was twisted, presented by the queen as a clear admission of guilt. Seraphina sighed, a sound of profound and counterfeit sorrow. "It is with a heavy heart that we pass judgment," the queen announced, her voice echoing in the hall. The king shifted uncomfortably but did not speak. "We believe in mercy. Therefore, you will not be met with the executioner's axe," a pause for effect. "Instead, you will be given a life of service. You will work in the castle laundry until the end of your days, to repay your debt to the crown you so grievously betrayed. Your title is forfeit. You are no longer Lady Anya of House Vale. You are simply Anya, a prisoner of the king's justice." The sentence was, in its own way, more cruel than death. It was an erasure. As the guards led her away, she did not look back. There was nothing left for her in that world of light and lies. They led her down into the belly of the castle. The air grew thick and hot, the elegant tapestries giving way to damp, weeping stone. The sounds of the court faded, replaced by the rhythmic slosh of water and the hiss of steam. This was the castle's laundry, a sprawling subterranean chamber where the filth of the nobility was scrubbed away by women who had lost their names and faces. The heat was a physical blow, the air tasting of lye soap and human sweat. This was her tomb. Her new life began without ceremony. She was handed a rough-spun tunic and put to work at a massive stone basin, her hands plunged into scalding water. The other women barely looked at her, their eyes dull with exhaustion. They worked in a heavy silence, their movements mechanical. Within an hour, Anya's hands were red and raw. The skin on her knuckles split. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. This was pain of a different sort. It was a grinding, spirit-crushing misery, designed to scour away every last remnant of who she had once been. Days bled into a meaningless blur of steam and labor. Despair, a cold and heavy thing, settled deep in her bones. She felt herself disappearing. Then a small kindness. An old woman with eyes the color of a faded sky, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, silently placed a cup of water and a small piece of hard bread beside Anya's workstation. She was Elspeth, the head laundress, a woman who had served in the castle since before Seraphina's time. She said nothing, but her gesture was a lifeline in an ocean of indifference. One afternoon, stumbling with exhaustion, Anya's foot slipped on the wet stone floor. She fell hard against a rough-hewn wall, a sharp pain lancing up her arm. A long bloody scrape ran from her elbow to her shoulder, the sleeve of her tunic torn. "Careful now, child," Elspeth said, her voice raspy but gentle. She helped Anya up and guided her to a small, secluded alcove, away from the others. "Let me see to that. We cannot have it getting infected." Elspeth took a damp cloth to clean the wound. She gently pulled back the torn fabric of the tunic from Anya's shoulder, and then she stopped. Her hand froze. Her breath hitched. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, were fixed on Anya's skin just above the scrape. "What is it?" Anya asked, her voice hoarse. "Saints preserve us," Elspeth whispered, her hand trembling. "It cannot be." Anya glanced down at her own shoulder. "It is just a birthmark. I have had it my entire life." "A birthmark?" Elspeth's voice was choked with a strange mix of awe and terror. "Child, that is no simple mark." She looked around wildly, then pulled Anya deeper into the shadows of the alcove, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me. Listen very carefully. What did your father tell you of your mother?" "He told me she died when I was born," Anya said, confused by the woman's intensity. "That she was a lady from a minor house." Elspeth shook her head, tears welling in her tired eyes. "He lied to protect you. Child, do you see the shape of it? It is a star, a silver star. That is the Star of Lyria, the sacred birthmark of the first king, a mark that appears only on the firstborn of the true royal bloodline." Anya stared at her, the words making no sense. "The royal bloodline? But your mother," Elspeth continued, her voice a torrent of secrets, "was not from a minor house. Her name was Lyra. She was the secret elder sister of the late queen. Isidora, the true heir. She was exiled by her own father for falling in love with a man beneath her station, a royal historian. They said she died in a remote cottage, that her child died with her. But they were wrong. The world tilted on its axis. The historian, her father, the man who taught her the ancient laws and royal lineages. It was not academic curiosity, it was her legacy. The King Theron, he is of a lesser branch. He only has the throne because he married Queen Isidora. Elspeth whispered urgently, and Seraphina has it only through him. Your blood is older. Your claim is absolute. That mark on your shoulder is not a blemish. It is a crown. Anya staggered back, her hand flying to her shoulder, the skin tingling, as if branded anew. The laundry, the steam, the pain in her hands, it all faded away. She was a prisoner, a slave, and she was the rightful Queen of Eldoria. The two truths warred in her mind, a clashing of realities so violent it threatened to tear her apart. The despair that had been her constant companion vanished, burned away in the searing heat of this revelation. The cold dread was replaced by something else entirely. A rage so pure and cold it felt like ice, forming in her veins. She looked at her raw, bleeding hands, and for the first time in her life, they did not look like the hands of a victim. They looked like the hands of a woman who had just been given a weapon. She was a secret, hidden in plain sight. And she would not remain hidden for much longer. For the next several days, Anya worked as if in a trance. Her body moved through the punishing rhythm of the laundry, hauling water, scrubbing fabrics until her knuckles bled. But her mind was elsewhere. It was soaring through the halls of history, poring over the lessons her father had taught her, re-examining every law, every precedent, every forgotten detail of her own lineage. The oppressive heat of the laundry no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a forge. The rage and shock from Elspeth's revelation had been hammered and cooled into something new, something infinitely more dangerous, a diamond-hard, ice-cold purpose. She saw the castle differently now. It was no longer a prison, it was a chessboard. The guards were not merely her captors, they were pawns, their patrol routes patterns to be learned. The gossiping servants were not just sources of noise, they were an information network, their whispers carrying truths and lies that could be sifted for advantage. And Queen Seraphina was no longer a terrifying, all-powerful monarch. She was just an opponent who had no idea a new player had just entered the game. Her alliance was forged in the dead of night, in a small, dark corner behind the great water boilers, where the shadows were deepest. Elspeth, her face etched with fear but her eyes resolute, would meet her there. The old laundress brought her scraps of food and news from the upper castle. She is growing more paranoid, Elspeth whispered one night, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the dying embers. Captain Valerius has doubled the guard on her chambers. She trusts no one. Good, Anya said, her voice low and steady. It held a new authority that startled even herself. A frightened queen makes mistakes. We need to know who in the court still holds loyalty to the old ways, to my grandmother's line. Elspeth's knowledge was a treasure trove. She spoke of Lord Rhys, the head of the King's Council, a man whose honor was as unyielding as the northern mountains. She spoke of the cook, who despised the queen for her wastefulness. She spoke of a young stable boy whose father had been a knight sworn to Anya's true grandmother. Each name was a potential piece on the board, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. They will never believe you, Elspeth fretted, her hands twisting in her apron. You are a convicted traitor. To speak of this is to invite death. Then I will not speak of it, Anya countered, her eyes gleaming in the faint firelight. Not at first. We will not ask for their belief. We will earn it. We will not attack Seraphina's power with a sword. We will dismantle it with the truth. And so the plan was born. A strategy built not on force, but on Anya's most powerful and underestimated weapon, her mind. Their target was Lord Rhys. Anya explained her reasoning to Elspeth, her words precise and strategic. Lord Rhys is a man of law, she said. He is bound by it. Right now, he has no legal reason to oppose the Queen, no matter how much he may dislike her. We must give him one. I will not send him a plea for help. I will send him a puzzle. a question of history and law so obscure that only a handful of scholars would even understand it, a question that points, like a compass needle, directly to the flaw in the king's claim to the throne. Elspeth stared, her apprehension slowly giving way to awe. She was seeing the birth of a queen, not in a palace, but in the grime and shadows of a dungeon. The most difficult part was acquiring the tools. Paper was a luxury beyond imagining. Ink was impossible. But Elspeth, resourceful and determined, was a master of the castle's unseen currents. A day later she returned with a tiny piece of charcoal, scavenged from a cold hearth, and a clean, smooth scrap of parchment that had been discarded from the maester's study. It was more precious than any jewel. That night, by the light of a single, sputtering candle stub, Anya wrote. Her fingers, clumsy and stiff from her labor, carefully formed the ancient letters. The message was a work of artful manipulation. It did not mention her name or her situation. It was posed as a hypothetical query from an anonymous student of the law. It began. It was perfect, specific enough to be undeniable, yet vague enough to be safe. It was bait, designed to snag the curiosity of a legal mind like Reese's. She folded the small parchment, her heart pounding. This was the first true act of rebellion, the first stone cast. She handed it to Elspeth. The old woman's hand trembled as she took it, the weight of their conspiracy feeling as heavy as gold. Anya was no longer a prisoner of her circumstances. She was becoming the architect of her destiny. In the heart of that oppressive castle, a quiet rebellion was born. All it needed was a spark of belief from the outside world. If you stand with this nascent rebellion, let your voice be heard from afar. Declare which kingdom you are watching from in the comments, and lend your strength to the coming storm. Elspeth tucked the note into a hidden fold of her dress. It will be in his private study before morning, she vowed, her voice firm. She gave Anya a single, determined nod, then melted back into the shadows, leaving Anya alone with the flickering candle. The die was cast. The first move in a silent war had been made. There was no turning back. Anya did not know if it would lead to salvation or to the executioner's block. But as she blew out the candle, plunging her small corner of the world into darkness, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope, and it was terrifying. The days that followed were a unique form of torture. Anya existed in a state of suspended animation, every nerve alight with a terrible, vibrant fear. Each time a guard's shadow fell across the laundry entrance, her heart seized in her chest. Every unexpected shout from the courtyard above was, in her mind, the sound of Elspeth being discovered. She watched the old woman's every movement, searching her weary face for any sign of trouble, any hint that their conspiracy had been unearthed. The physical agony of her work became a strange comfort, the burn in her muscles and the sting of lie on her raw hands a welcome anchor to reality, keeping her from floating away on a sea of crippling anxiety. She thought of the message, a tiny scrap of parchment making its perilous journey through the castle. It felt both impossibly fragile and as heavy as a mountain. It was her life and Elspeth's, folded into a few carefully chosen words. It was everything. On the third day, Elspeth returned from her duties delivering clean linens to the royal chambers. As she passed Anya's workstation, she did not look at her, but her head gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled Anya's knees, washed over her. That night, in the Wahos, humid darkness of their secret meeting place, Elspeth recounted the tale in a hushed whisper. His study was empty, she said, her eyes wide. The desk was covered in maps and scrolls. I slipped it beneath a roll of parchment tied with a blue ribbon. I nearly dropped it. My hands were shaking so. She described how she had hidden in the corridor, pretending to sort linens, her heart a frantic drum. She saw Lord Rees enter his study, his face creased with the worries of the kingdom. He sat at his desk, sorting through the scrolls. He found Anya's note. He unrolled it, his brow furrowing as he read. He read it once, then a second time, his expression shifting from curiosity to a deep, profound concentration. He looked around the room as if searching for the ghost who had left it. Then, instead of casting it aside, he folded it carefully and tucked it deep within the sleeve of his robes. He had taken the bait. Miles away from the steam and squalor of the laundry, in a study lined with the wisdom of ages, Lord Rees sat before a crackling fire. The mysterious note lay open on the table before him. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the law, to the clear and logical structures that held the kingdom together. This message was an elegant, intellectual hand grenade tossed into the heart of that structure. He recognized the legal theory. It was archaic, sound, and deeply dangerous. More than that, he recognized the ghost of the handwriting. It was finer, more precise, but the formation of the letters was an echo of his old, disgraced friend, the historian Alistair Vale, Anya's father, a man he had always believed was unjustly ruined by the Queen's ambition. Rees had long harbored a quiet distaste for Seraphina, for her vanity and her transparent manipulations of the weak king. But he was a man of proof, not feeling. This note, this impossible question, was the first stirring of something tangible. He rose from his chair and walked to a locked bookshelf at the back of the room. From it, he pulled down heavy, leather-bound tomes, the laws of succession, the annals of King Alaric I, the secret histories of the House of Eldoria. He lit another branch of candles, his face grim with purpose. His quiet disapproval of the Queen had now been given a voice, a question that demanded an answer, and he would not rest until he found it. Unaware of the new fire she had lit in the old lord's heart, Anya knew she could not afford to wait. One question was a curiosity. A pattern was proof. She and Elspeth planned their second move. This one had to be more daring, a message that could not be dismissed as a scholar's hypothetical query. It had to be personal. Anya spent 2 nights mentally composing the next note, her memory, her only parchment. It was a question about a secret addendum to the Eldorian Charter, a clause concerning the transfer of power in the event of a monarch's capture during wartime. The clause had been added by Anya's great-grandfather and witnessed by only 2 men outside the royal family. One of them had been Lord Rees's father. The other was a knight, long dead. To know of this addendum was to know a secret shared only by the highest echelons of power. It was a key that should have been lost to history. Elspeth, her fear now eclipsed by a fierce, protective loyalty, made the second delivery. The weight was even more agonizing than the first. The stakes were higher. This was not just a question. It was a claim, a statement that the author was someone who possessed impossible knowledge. Days passed with no signal. Anya's hope began to fray, replaced by the cold certainty that they had overreached, that their luck had run out. She imagined Elspeth in a dungeon, or Lord Rees handing the notes to Captain Valerius. Then the signal came. It was not a note, nor a nod. Elspeth came to her, her face a mask of neutrality, and told her to check the public proclamation board near the kitchens, as a new order on grain rationing had been posted. Anya, her heart hammering, found an excuse to pass by it. There was the mundane decree, full of official language, but at the bottom, beside the royal scribe's signature, was the official stamp of the Lord of the Council, Lord Rees. And stamped in the wax was a seal she had only ever read about in her father's books. It was not the king's seal, it was the seal of House Rees, an emblem he had not used in public for over a decade. It was a snarling wolf's head. Anya leaned against the cold stone wall, a slow smile spreading across her face. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Lord Rees was no longer just a curious old man reading scrolls. He was hunting. He was on their side. And that meant their silent 2-person conspiracy had just gained the most powerful ally in the kingdom. But it also meant their war was about to step out of the shadows. Anya learned that a plan in motion has a life of its own. Her small, secret actions had sent ripples through the stagnant waters of the court, and now those ripples were becoming waves. The castle itself seemed to be holding its breath. The oppressive, predictable routine had been replaced by a nervous, volatile energy that crackled in the air. Anya could feel it even in the castle's depths. The servants whispered more, their eyes darting about. The guards marched with a new, aggressive tension, their faces grim. The fear that had once been Anya's alone was now a shared commodity. Elspeth's nightly reports became the focal point of Anya's existence. As the old woman spoke in hushed tones, Anya would close her eyes and picture the scenes, her imagination painting vivid portraits of the world above. She saw the royal council chamber, its long table polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the anxious faces of the kingdom's most powerful men. And at that table she saw her ally, Lord Rhys, beginning his silent assault. "He is a master," Elspeth whispered, her voice filled with a reluctant admiration. "He does not accuse. He simply asks." He asked about the state of the treasury, citing a shortfall from the northern tariffs. He asked about an old treaty with the Iron Baronies, questioning a clause about maritime rights. Each question is a small, polite inquiry, but together, they are chipping away at the king's authority, stone by stone. Anya pictured it clearly. She saw the weak King Theron, unable to answer, deferring to his wife, and she saw Queen Seraphina, forced to respond, her smile growing thinner and more brittle with each question from the old lord. Rhys was using the law as his shield and his sword, and the queen, who ruled by whim and fear, had no defense against it. She could not silence him without looking like a tyrant, yet allowing him to speak was to allow her own power to be questioned. The pressure began to fester, and the queen's flawless facade started to crack. Elspeth brought stories of Seraphina's increasingly erratic behavior. She had banished a court musician for playing a tune she found melancholy. She had publicly humiliated her own master of the hounds because his dogs were too loud beneath her window. Her cruelty, once reserved for private moments and powerless targets like Anya, was now spilling out into the open. "She is consumed by the idea of treason," Elspeth reported, her face pale. "She speaks of loyalty constantly. She has confined the king to his chambers, claiming he suffers from a recurring fever. But we all know the truth. She has isolated him. She is ruling alone now, and through fear." Captain Valerius was no longer just the captain of the guard. He was the queen's personal enforcer, a black-clad specter of her paranoia. His men were everywhere, their presence a constant, silent threat. Anya listened to these reports with a grim, chilling satisfaction. She was the ghost haunting the queen's feast, the invisible source of the corrosion that was eating away at Seraphina's peace. The queen was lashing out at shadows, never suspecting that the real threat was a girl scrubbing floors in her own dungeon. Then, Seraphina's fear caused her to make her first truly public mistake. It happened during a council meeting to review old land grants, a tedious but necessary administrative task. Lord Rhys, as was his duty, proposed the review. She refused, Elspeth recounted, her eyes still wide with the memory. She did not just refuse, she slammed her hand on the table and declared that the crown's grants were absolute and not subject to review by lesser lords. Her voice was sharp, too loud. The other councilmen, they looked at each other. They saw what she was, not a confident ruler, but a frightened one, clinging to power. Seraphina's overreaction was a fatal miscalculation. In her desperate attempt to block Rhys from digging into the past, she had revealed her own insecurity to everyone. She had shown them that she was afraid of what he might find, the seeds of doubt Anya had planted in Rhys's mind were now beginning to sprout in the minds of others. That night, as Anya and Elspeth met in their hiding spot, a new sound echoed from the corridor beyond the laundry, the rhythmic tramp of heavy boots. It was a patrol, far deeper in the castle's service levels and much later than their usual rounds. They doused their candle instantly, pressing themselves into the darkness, their hearts pounding in unison. The footsteps grew louder, past their hiding place, and then slowly faded away. They waited in the suffocating silence. "That has never happened before," Elspeth finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Never." She knows, Anya breathed, the reality of it, a cold weight in her stomach. She doesn't know who or how, but she knows the threat is inside the castle. The next day, the proof of her words arrived. A new decree was posted, not from the king, but from the queen's office. Captain Valerius was authorized to conduct random searches of any room and to detain any servant for questioning at his sole discretion. The queen's invisible war against her unseen enemy had just become terrifyingly real. Their secret battlefield was no longer safe. The queen was no longer just watching the lords in her council. She was now hunting the mice in her walls. The Sunstone Festival was the heart of the Eldorian summer, a day when the entire castle burst with a frantic, forced celebration. The great hall was unrecognizable, draped in banners of gold and crimson. Minstrels played in every corner, their music a cheerful veneer over the court's nervous tension. For Anya, hidden in a small dark storage closet just off the main hall, the sounds were a distant roar, the thunder of an approaching battle. Hours earlier, Elspeth had come to her, pressing a bundle of fabric into her hands. It was a simple dress of deep blue wool, clean and mended. With it was a small folded note from Lord Rhys. It contained only 2 words. Anya's heart had been pounding a relentless rhythm against her ribs ever since. This was the precipice. Every secret message, every whispered plan, every moment of terror and hope had led to this single night. She smoothed the front of the blue dress, the simple fabric feeling like royal silk after months in rough spun. Elspeth had done what she could, washing her face and hair, braiding it simply. The transformation was startling. The grime of the laundry was gone, but the hardship remained, etched in the new, hard lines of her face and the unyielding fire in her eyes. She was no longer a girl. She was a weapon, polished and aimed. From a crack in the door she could see the high table. Queen Seraphina was a vision in gold, laughing and drinking, playing the part of the magnanimous ruler. She radiated confidence, a woman who believed she had finally stamped out the whispers of dissent. She believed she had won. It was the arrogance of a tyrant, the fatal flaw Anya had been counting on. The feast reached its zenith. The king raised a goblet to toast the harvest, his words slurring slightly. The lords and ladies cheered, and in that moment of peak celebration, Lord Rhys stood up. He was an old man, but he rose with the unbending strength of an ancient oak. He struck the butt of his ceremonial staff once on the stone floor. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the din like a crack of thunder. The music faltered, laughter died in throats. A tense silence fell over the hall. "Your Majesties." Rhys's voice boomed, clear and strong, leaving no room for interruption. "I beg your pardon for this intrusion on our festivities, but I must ask the court's indulgence on a matter of grave importance. A matter that concerns the honor of this crown, the legitimacy of the succession, and the very soul of this kingdom." Seraphina's smile froze on her face, turning into a brittle, angry line. "Lord Rhys, this is neither the time nor the place for—" "It is precisely the time and the place," Rhys countered, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobles. Captain Valerius took a step forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword, but 2 other lords, old friends of Rhys's house, shifted their positions, subtly boxing him in. Rhys turned and nodded toward the small storage closet. "The laws of Eldoria state that any citizen, no matter their station, may bring a grievance before the nobility on this day, and there is one who would speak." The heavy closet door swung open. 2 of Rhys's own household guards stood there. They bowed their heads to Anya, a gesture of profound respect that sent a fresh wave of shock through the hall. Taking a deep breath, Anya stepped out of the shadows and into the blazing torchlight. A collective gasp went through the room. They recognized her. This was the disgraced lady-in-waiting, the convicted thief, the woman who had been sent to the dungeons to be forgotten. But the person who stood before them was not the broken creature they had imagined. Her posture was straight, her head held high, her gaze sweeping across them without fear. She walked to the center of the hall, her simple blue dress a stark contrast to the glittering silks and velvets around her. Her steps were even and deliberate, the sound of her soft shoes on the stone, the only noise in the cavernous room. She stopped and turned to face the high table. "Your Majesties," Anya began. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "You know me as Anya, a traitor convicted of stealing the king's signet." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I am here to tell you that was a lie told by a queen who feared the truth more than she valued justice." "How dare you!" Seraphina's voice was a venomous shriek. "You will be silenced for this insolence." "I will not be silenced again," Anya said, her voice rising in power and clarity. It was the voice of a woman with nothing left to lose. "I was framed by a queen who saw a threat in my eyes, who feared the legacy of the woman who came before her. She used her power to ruin my name and condemn me to a life of servitude, but she did not know the truth of my blood. She did not know the secret I carried." Seraphina laughed, a high, sharp sound of disbelief. "A secret? You are a delusional girl. You have no proof of these wild accusations, nothing but the words of a convicted criminal." Anya locked her eyes with the queen's. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "I have more than proof, Seraphina," she said. "The use of the queen's name without a title, a deliberate, shocking insult. I have birthright." With a slow, steady movement that captivated every person in the hall, Anya reached for the collar of her dress. She pulled the simple blue wool aside, baring her right shoulder to the flickering torchlight. And there it was, shimmering on her skin, unmistakable and legendary, was a mark the color of pale silver. It was shaped like a perfect eight-pointed star, the ancient sacred sigil of the first kings of Eldoria, the Star of Lyria. The gasp that tore through the great hall was a physical thing, a hurricane of disbelief, awe, and terror. Lords and ladies surged to their feet. Servants dropped their platters. King Theron's jaw hung open, his face ashen, and Queen Seraphina's face, in one horrifying moment, crumpled from rage into the stark, naked panic of a cornered animal. The mark was not a story. It was not a myth. It was real, and it was on the shoulder of the girl she had tried to destroy. The room, the kingdom, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the fallout of the truth that had just been unleashed. The silence in the great hall was a physical force, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Hundreds of people, from the highest lord to the lowest kitchen hand, were frozen, their eyes locked on the shimmering, star-shaped mark on Anya's shoulder. It was a sigil from myth and legend, a mark of divine right that no one present had ever truly believed they would see. In that moment, Anya did not need to speak. The truth was not in her words, but in her blood, displayed for all the world to see. She stood her ground, her shoulder bare, letting the impossible reality sink into the minds of her people. It was Queen Seraphina who shattered the silence. Her voice was not the melodic, controlled instrument of a monarch, but the raw, unhinged shriek of a cornered animal. "Lies!" she screamed, her face contorted with a mask of pure fury. "Witchcraft! It is a trick, a glamour painted on her skin to deceive you all." She whirled on her husband, the king, her jeweled fingers digging into his arm. "Theron, do something. Are you a king or a statue? This is treason. Order her seized." But King Theron was broken. He stared at Anya, at the birthmark, his face ashen. He looked as though he had seen a ghost, the ghost of the true royal line he and his family had supplanted. He was a hollow man, a crown without a head, and in the one moment his kingdom needed a king, he was nothing. Realizing her husband was useless, a broken puppet whose strings she could no longer pull, Seraphina turned to her final, most loyal weapon. Her voice rose to a fever pitch, cracking with desperation. "Captain Valerius," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Anya, "I am your queen. I gave you an order. Seize the traitor, kill her if you must, but rid me of her. Kill the witch." It was a fatal mistake. Her command to murder an unarmed woman in the middle of the court without trial or process stripped away the last veneer of her legitimacy. She was no longer a queen demanding justice. She was a tyrant demanding blood. Captain Valerius, ever the obedient soldier, drew his long sword. The rasp of steel sliding from its scabbard was unnaturally loud in the tense hall. For one terrifying second it seemed he would obey. He took a heavy step toward Anya, his face a grim mask of conflict. Anya stood her ground. She did not tremble. She did not beg. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes burning with the cold fire of her newfound authority. And in that moment Valerius hesitated. He was a man loyal not to a person, but to power. And he was not a fool. He saw the shimmering, undeniable sigil on Anya's shoulder. He saw Lord Rhys, his own hand now on the hilt of his family's ancient sword. He saw a dozen other powerful lords and knights, their expressions hardening from shock into a steely resolve, their hands moving to their own weapons. He saw the faces of his own men, the royal guards, looking at him with confusion and dawning doubt. To obey Seraphina now would be to charge into the swords of the most powerful houses in the kingdom. It would be suicide. His loyalty, weighed on the scales of survival, finally found its limit. "Hold, Captain!" Lord Rhys's voice rang out, filled with an authority the king had never possessed. He drew his own blade, not in aggression, but in defense. "You will not lay a hand on the true blood of Eldoria." Like a silent, choreographed movement, other nobles followed suit. Swords were drawn not to attack, but to form a protective wall around Anya. The balance of power in the kingdom shifted in the space of 3 heartbeats. Seraphina's reign, built on a foundation of fear and lies, evaporated the moment the truth came to light. Her screams for loyalty were met with the sight of steel turning against her. She was utterly, completely alone. In that moment, the crown did not pass by decree, but by the will of the truth itself. A tyrant's desperate scream was drowned out by the silent roar of justice. This was the turning of the tide, the moment an empire of lies began to crumble. If you believe that all thrones built on deceit are destined to fall, subscribe now and witness the dawn of a new era. Seeing his position was hopeless, seeing the war he would unleash and lose, Captain Valerius made the only choice a pragmatist could. With a look of grim acceptance, he slowly, deliberately turned his sword, holding the gleaming blade in his gauntleted hand. He walked the few paces to Anya, his steps heavy on the stone floor. He went to one knee, bowing his head, and laid his long sword at her feet. "My sword is yours," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but heavy with the weight of his surrender. "I yield to the true heir of Eldoria." At the sight of their captain kneeling, the rest of the royal guards visibly relaxed, lowering their own weapons. The threat was over. A final animalistic cry of rage and disbelief tore from Seraphina's throat as Lord Rhys's personal guards, their path now clear, moved in and seized her arms. She struggled, her regal gown twisting, her hair falling from its perfect arrangement. She was a queen no more, just a desperate woman whose gambit had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Anya looked from the kneeling captain, the instrument of her past misery, to the captured, sputtering woman who had orchestrated it all. Then she looked at the faces of the court, all now turned to her. The chaos subsided, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They were waiting. For an order, for a judgment, for a queen. The weight of their gaze was heavier than any crown. In the ringing silence that followed the surrender, every soul in the great hall looked to Anya. She was the eye of the hurricane, the quiet center around which the fate of the kingdom now spun. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of smoke, wine, and a new startling authority. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but her purpose was now a shield. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear, and it did not tremble. "Lord Rhys," she said, her gaze finding the old lord, "take the woman who was once called queen to the highest room in the royal tower. See that she is comfortable, but post your most trusted men at her door. She is not to speak with anyone." Rhys bowed his head, a gesture of fealty. "At once, your grace." He motioned to his guards, who began to escort the struggling, cursing Seraphina from the hall. Next, Anya turned her attention to the kneeling figure of Captain Valerius. His head was bowed, his sword still at her feet. "Captain Valerius, rise." He looked up, his face grim, expecting a sentence of death. He rose slowly to his feet. "Your first loyalty is to the crown of Eldoria," Anya stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Not to the person who wears it. You will prove that loyalty now. Command your men to secure the castle. No one enters or leaves these walls without my express permission, or that of Lord Rhys. Prevent any whisper of this night's events from leaving the city until dawn. Is that understood?" Valerius stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his hardened eyes. This was not the vengeful girl he had expected. This was a commander. "Yes," he said, his voice raspy. "It is understood." He retrieved his sword, gave her a stiff, formal bow, and turned to bark orders at his men, his voice once again filled with purpose. The gears of power were beginning to turn at her command. Hours later, the great hall was empty, its festive banners now looking like relics of a forgotten age. Anya sat at the head of the long table in the royal council chamber. The throne at the far end of the room remained empty. With her were Lord Rhys and a half-dozen other senior lords who had stood with her. The former, King Theron, sat among them, a silent, hollowed-out man who seemed to have aged a decade in a single night. They spoke of what was to come, of how to ensure a peaceful transition of power, of which houses could be trusted. Anya listened more than she spoke, her mind absorbing the complex tapestry of alliances and rivalries. The lessons her father had taught her, once academic, were now intensely practical. She saw these powerful men not as legends or enemies, but simply as men, with their own ambitions and fears. Her time as an invisible servant had been a better education in statecraft than any tutor could have provided. She had learned to read the truth behind the polite words, to see the calculation behind the loyal gazes. Before the sun rose, she knew she had to settle the debts of the past. First, Captain Valerius was brought before the council. He stood straight, his face a stone mask, ready for his judgment. "You followed the orders of a false queen," Anya said, her voice quiet. "You enforced a cruel and unjust sentence upon me. You would have stood by and watched me rot. Tell me why I should not have your head." "There is no reason," Valerius said, his voice flat. "I served the power that was. That is what a soldier does. An order was given, and I obeyed. That is my crime, and I will not apologize for it." Anya studied him for a long moment. She saw no remorse, but she also saw no deceit. She saw a pragmatic, dangerous man whose loyalty could be a powerful tool, if aimed correctly. "I do not need apologies," Anya said finally. "I need loyal men. Eldoria needs loyal men. You are stripped of your rank as captain of the Royal Guard. You will be reassigned. The northern border is beset by raiders, and the garrisons there are weak. You will take a command at Blackridge Keep. Serve the kingdom there. Prove your loyalty to the people of Eldoria, not to a title. Redeem your honor with service, or die in the snow. The choice is yours." Valerius's eyes widened in disbelief. This was not death. It was a second chance, a harsh and unforgiving one, but a chance nonetheless. "I accept," he said, and for the first time there was a hint of something other than grim duty in his voice. It was respect. Finally, Seraphina was brought in. Her finery was gone, replaced by a simple woolen dress. Her hair was unbound, her face pale with fury. She stared at Anya with pure, undiluted hatred. "You think you have won, little gutter rat," she spat. "They will never love you." A scullery maid with a strange mark on her shoulder, playing queen. Anya listened to the tirade without emotion. When Seraphina finally fell silent, panting for breath, Anya spoke, her voice calm and even. "Your greatest fear was not death, Seraphina. It was insignificance. You were so terrified of being forgotten that you tore the kingdom apart to make your mark. A quick execution would be a mercy. It would make you a martyr in some people's eyes. I will not grant you that dignity." She leaned forward slightly. My mother was exiled to the Silent Sisterhood on the Isle of Storms. I am told it is a place of profound quiet, a place where names and histories are forgotten, where all that matters is repentance. You will be taken there at dawn. You will live out the rest of your days in total obscurity. No one will speak your name. No one will remember your face. You will have exactly what you deserve, nothing. The color drained from Seraphina's face. For the first time, true, abject terror filled her eyes. A life of complete anonymity was a hell she could not have imagined. She began to scream, a string of curses and pleas, as the guards dragged her away. Anya was left in the council chamber with Lord Rhys. The first rays of dawn were beginning to light the high windows. She looked at the empty throne, gleaming faintly in the new light. The crown felt heavier now than it ever had in her dreams. "I never wanted this," she whispered, the admission costing her a great deal. "I only wanted justice. And now you must wield it," Lord Rhys said gently. "The council has formally recognized your claim. The preparations for your coronation will begin at once. You have shown them your strength. Now you must show them your grace." Anya stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. The girl who had scrubbed floors and dreamed only of surviving the next day was gone forever. In her place was a queen, forged in fire and betrayal, with the fate of a kingdom resting squarely on her shoulders. The hardest part, she knew, was yet to come. The weeks that followed were a blur of frantic work and quiet consolidation. Under the steady hand of Lord Rhys, the kingdom's council was reformed. Under the watchful eye of Anya, the court was cleansed of Seraphina's spies and sycophants. A fragile peace settled over the land, a peace built on the stunning revelation of a long, lost truth. Anya learned quickly that wielding power was a far more complex, an exhausting task than seizing it. She met with lords, merchants, and generals, her days filled with the endless, grinding work of ruling. She did it all from the council chamber, refusing to even sit upon the throne until the kingdom had formally and rightfully accepted her. Finally, the day of her coronation arrived. It dawned crisp and clear, a perfect autumn morning. Anya stood in the royal chambers looking at her own reflection. Gone was the servant in rags. Gone was the girl in the simple blue dress. The woman staring back at her was dressed in robes of state, a gown of deep silver that shimmered like moonlight on water, embroidered with the dark blue star of her ancestors. The dress was a queen's, but the eyes were still her own, holding the memory of every hardship, every fear, and every lesson learned in the dark. Elspeth was there, her hands trembling, as she made the final adjustments to the gown. She did not speak, her throat thick with unshed tears of joy. Anya placed a hand over the old woman's. It was a silent acknowledgment of everything that had passed between them, a promise that the sacrifices made in the shadows would never be forgotten in the light. The walk to the great hall was not a march of conquest, but a solemn procession of purpose. The corridors were lined with the people of the castle, from the highest nobles to the lowest stable hands. As she passed, they bowed. It was not the fearful, coerced deference they had shown Seraphina. It was a deep, quiet gesture of respect, of hope. She was not a distant ruler to them. They had seen her at her lowest. They had seen her fall, and now they were witnessing her rise. She was one of them. The great hall was filled to capacity, but a reverent silence held the air. The festive banners of the Sunstone Festival were gone, replaced with the ancient somber tapestries of the royal house of Eldoria. Lord Rhys stood before the empty throne, his face radiating a solemn dignity. Anya walked the long aisle, her steps sure and steady, her gaze fixed forward. She knelt upon a single velvet cushion placed before the dais. Lord Rhys began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. He spoke of the long winter of deceit that the kingdom had endured. He spoke of the restoration of the true bloodline, not as a prize won in a war, but as a wound being healed. He called forward the former king, Theron, who, looking like a man finally unburdened, formally renounced the throne for himself and his heirs, his voice barely a whisper. Then Rhys turned to Anya. From a velvet box he lifted the crown of Eldoria. It was a heavy, ancient thing, wrought of dark old gold, set with a single uncut sapphire in its center. It was not a glittering, fanciful piece like the tiaras Seraphina had favored. It was a crown of substance, of history, of weight. He held it high for all to see. "By the old laws and the new dawn," Rhys proclaimed, his voice ringing with conviction, "by the will of the people and the truth of her blood, we recognize our one true sovereign." He began to lower the crown toward Anya's bowed head. They had tried to bury her, to erase her name and her legacy from the pages of history, but they did not know that in the heart of their darkest dungeon they had not buried a victim, but had planted a seed. From the ashes of her past a queen had risen, forged not by birthright alone, but by the will she had discovered in the shadows, by the wisdom she had earned through suffering. Her reign was just beginning. If her story has proven to you that the deepest scars can forge the strongest crowns, then join this kingdom of storytellers. Subscribe, and ensure that more legends like hers are never forgotten. The cold, heavy weight of the crown settled upon her head. It felt less like an ornament and more like an anchor connecting her to her past, to her people, and to her future. For a moment she felt the ghosts of her parents beside her, their love a warm presence, their sacrifice finally given meaning. She rose to her feet. No longer Anya of House Vale, the laundress, the traitor. She was Queen Anya the First, sovereign of Eldoria. She turned to face her people, a sea of faces all looking up at her. She did not see them as subjects to be ruled. She saw them as a trust to be kept. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, an expression of peace and profound responsibility. And from the crowd, a single person began to cheer. Then another, and another, until the great hall was filled with a thunderous, genuine, and deafening roar of acclamation. It was the sound of hope reborn. It was the sound of a kingdom welcoming its true queen home. Her journey through the fire was over. Her reign had just begun.